This is one of the rarest large-scale melee battle sequences in the history of cinema. Based on a true event from Scottish history, the story is set in the year 1304. At the time, Scotland was suffering a tragic blow. King Alexander had died unexpectedly, leaving no heir to the throne. In an attempt to resolve the succession crisis, a group of Scottish lords invited King Edward I of England to Scotland to act as a mediator, but this act of inviting in a wolf ultimately led to disaster. Edward took the opportunity to seize control of Scotland and began imposing a brutal regime designed to enrich himself. Under his tyranny, the Scottish people rose up, led by William Wallace, but the rebellion ended in a crushing defeat. In the aftermath, many of the Scottish nobles surrendered, and Edward captured the last remaining castle in Scotland. During the surrender ceremony, Edward accepted the oaths of loyalty from the nobles and brought two men before him, Robert the Bruce and John Comyn. These two were the most eligible contenders for the Scottish throne, yet Edward granted neither of them the crown. To appear impartial, he appointed his own trusted man as the governor of Scotland and ordered Robert and John to submit to his leadership. He even urged them to reconcile. After the ceremony, a destitute noble named James Douglas approached Edward with a petition. His father had once fought alongside Wallace in the uprising, but after their defeat, he was captured and died a brutal death in an English prison. Now, James begged Edward to return his family lands. Edward coldly refused and had him thrown out. This man would later become Robert's fiercest warrior, known to the world as the Madman. Soon after, Edward gathered the nobles outside to showcase his new siege weapon. Although the lord inside Stirling Castle, the final Scottish stronghold, had already surrendered days ago, Edward refused to accept. He wanted to make an example. He aimed to use his new weapon to strike terror into the Scottish nobles and crush any remaining resistance. With a flaming projectile loaded into the trebuchet, Edward, like a demon in the eyes of the Scots, slashed the rope binding the mechanism. The massive fireball soared through the sky, crashing into the castle and obliterating the last symbol of Scottish defiance. When it was over, Edward casually walked over to Robert and praised his decision to submit. Robert remained silent. The words of praise scorched his soul like the flames still rising from the distant castle walls. He had once been destined to be King of Scotland. Now, he was nothing more than a pawn in another man's game. As they left, Robert's father tried to comfort him, saying he believed Edward would grant him the throne once the situation stabilized. That was why he had advised his son not to resist. Once he died, the crown would naturally pass to Robert, but Robert didn't agree. To him, being king in name only, while bowing to the English crown, was no better than being a servant. Still, bound by filial duty, he reluctantly chose to obey. Meanwhile, under Edward's increasing tax demands, life for ordinary Scots became unbearable. To replenish the army after crushing the rebellion, Edward began conscripting Scots into his forces, something the common folk had never expected after pledging loyalty. Their questions and doubts left Robert helpless. Even children weren't spared by the English soldiers sent to draft new recruits. At a loss for what to do, Robert was surprised when his wife Elizabeth stepped forward. She had been married to him in a political alliance arranged by Edward, meant to help control Scotland, but witnessing the people's suffering firsthand, she decided to stand with Robert. Not long after, Robert's father fell gravely ill. On his deathbed, he admitted that Edward was no longer the admirable friend he once thought he was. Endlessly compromising with him would only deepen the suffering of the Scottish people. He feared he had made a grave mistake. The next day, he passed away. His final words reignited Robert's desire for Scottish independence. After the funeral, while delivering taxes to the English border, Robert saw firsthand that he wasn't alone in his dream. In the town of Berwick, at the edge of both kingdoms, a pair of English knights brought a cart into the square. The bustling market suddenly fell silent. As Robert approached with the townspeople, he saw what was in the cart. It was the mutilated remains of William Wallace. The English had executed him by drawing and quartering, then sent parts of his body to different cities as a warning. One of those parts had been brought here. The people, furious over the inhuman treatment of their national hero, erupted in protest. Chaos ensued. In that moment of fury and awakening, Robert finally understood he wasn't the only one who had never given up. The spirit of resistance still echoed across Scottish soil. The people's spine had never been broken. With his inner fire rekindled, Robert rushed home and declared his intent to fight against England to his brothers. Until now, they had held back out of loyalty to their father's wishes. But now, they were all in. To rally support, Robert arranged a meeting with his old rival John Comyn, hoping to join forces for Scotland's freedom, but Comyn refused. He believed they had already failed once, and the people needed peace, not more war. Worse still, He planned to report Robert to Edward. If Robert were executed for treason, the throne would be his. Enraged and cornered, Robert stabbed Comyn on instinct, but when he realized what he had done, panic set in. In 13th century Europe, the church was at its peak of power. Even a future king couldn't escape punishment for spilling blood on holy ground. Robert turned himself into the church. After much discussion, the clergy chose to absolve him and even agreed to support his coronation on the condition that he swear allegiance to the church. Political power and religious authority might rise and fall, but these men understood the bigger picture. However, killing a rival in a sacred place caused controversy among the nobles. His upcoming coronation was far from universally accepted. This division would later haunt him on the battlefield. On his way to the coronation, Robert encountered James Douglas alone. Douglas knelt and pledged his loyalty. He wanted to fight England and reclaim his family's land. Robert gladly accepted. In 1306, Robert was crowned King of Scotland upon the Stone of Scone, known in history as Robert I. When news of this reached England, Edward was furious. He immediately declared Robert an outlaw. Anyone who encountered him could kill him on sight. No trial needed. His spoiled son begged to lead the campaign and Edward reluctantly granted him the honor. Meanwhile, Robert encountered Edward's puppet in Scotland, Valence. John Comyn, the man Robert had killed, was Valence's brother-in-law. He had both personal and political reasons to crush Robert. The tension was undeniable, but Robert's troops weren't ready for a full battle, so he proposed a duel. Valence agreed, but since it was the Sabbath, a day of worship, they agreed to postpone the fight until the next day. That night, Robert and his men set up camp, but at midnight, Valence launched a surprise attack. Flaming arrows lit up the sky, and the camp was thrown into chaos. Robert shielded his wife and daughter as best he could, but this was just the first wave. Though Douglas and others fought bravely, the untrained rebels were no match. In desperation, Robert handed his family to his brother and told them to seek refuge with a trusted lord. Then he drew his sword, took down a cavalryman, and tried to break through, but his horse was soon skewered by a spear. Once again, he found himself surrounded. Though his officers fought with unmatched courage, the rebels were vastly outnumbered. The battlefield was littered with the fallen. Seeing the hopelessness, Angus grabbed the bloodied Robert and led the survivors in retreat. By dawn, Valence found the field covered in bodies, but Robert had vanished. He was furious. Attacking without waiting for the prince had been a reckless move, and he knew he'd be held accountable. Meanwhile, Robert had only 50 soldiers left. Following Angus's advice, they set off for his hometown on the Isle of Islay, hoping to regroup and recruit. But on the way, they were blocked by another noble. Robert tried to persuade him to join their cause. Though he was disgusted by Robert's murder of his cousin Comyn, he admired his bravery and eventually let them pass. Days later, they reached the riverbank facing the Isle of Islay. They released the horses and planned to cross in 2 small boats. Robert, as king, boarded first. Douglas and the others stayed behind. What they didn't know was that Edward's son had already invaded Scotland, burning and pillaging to force the people to betray Robert. Even the noble who had let them pass was now en route to join the English. As Robert reached the other side and watched Angus rowing back, he saw enemy troops emerging from the forest. He rushed into the water, shouting a warning, but it was too late. Douglas and the others were already surrounded. They fought with everything they had, while Robert desperately rowed back to help. Angus made it back to shore. The remaining rebels tried to retreat while holding the line. As Robert neared the riverbank, he saw his own brother skewered by a spear. Grief overwhelmed him. The fighting continued until Douglas seized an opening and slit the enemy commander's throat. Only then did the attackers retreat. The survivors quickly boarded the boats, and Robert escaped once more battered, but alive. They finally reached the Isle of Islay and found the local lord. This man had once fought beside Wallace, but back then, Robert, under his father's command, had refused to send reinforcements. Because of that, the lord offered no help now. Still, impressed by Robert's resolve, he didn't interfere either. When Angus tried to plead their case, Robert stopped him. He believed that in time, the lord would come around. Without flinching, he turned and left. Eventually, they arrived in Angus's childhood village, where they could rest and recover. Back on the mainland, the English prince, furious at having lost Robert, decided to go after his family. He tracked Elizabeth to her hiding place and stormed the castle, taking them prisoner. Then, he interrogated Robert's brother, demanding to know his location, but they genuinely didn't know Robert had only made the decision to head for Islay after they split up. Frustrated and humiliated, The prince's rage boiled over. He strung the man up and disemboweled him. As for the old lord, his throat was ruthlessly slit. Elizabeth and Robert's young daughter were thrown into an English prison. Some time later, word of the tragedy reached the Isle of Islay. When Robert heard of his brother's brutal death and his family's capture, he could no longer sit still. He made up his mind to leave immediately. With personal grief and national hatred boiling in his heart, Robert decided to abandon all formalities. He would no longer abide by the code of chivalry. Having fewer men had its own advantages. He chose to wage guerrilla warfare using whatever tactics were most effective, no matter how dishonorable they seemed. He snuck back to his own castle, now occupied by the English, and found familiar faces, a woodsman he once knew and his loyal comrade, Douglas. They hid in the back of the woodsman's cart. Once inside the castle walls, they waited for the right moment. Then, slipping out of hiding, they joined forces with men waiting outside. Together, they ambushed the guards, catching the English completely off guard. To ensure the enemy couldn't use the castle as a base again, Robert set it ablaze, his own home engulfed in flames. Inspired by the tactic, Angus pulled off a similar move. He disguised his men and infiltrated a church on his former estate. While the enemy was distracted by a priest's sermon, Angus drew his dagger and launched a savage attack. With each battle, he developed a fearsome, unhinged style, yelling his name with bloodlust as he struck down his foes. Robert's use of guerrilla tactics, repulsive to knights but undeniably effective, left the English scrambling. As they reclaimed one stronghold after another, the rebellion gained momentum, and more joined the cause. When news of the uprising reached England, Edward was deeply disappointed in his son. With Robert's influence in Scotland growing rapidly, Edward decided to march north himself and crush the rebellion once and for all. In 1307, Edward led his army into Scotland, but at age 70, his aging body couldn't endure the harsh campaign. He fell ill and died on the way. His son took the throne as Edward II and became commander of the English army. Unlike the smaller pursuit parties before, this time he brought 3,000 elite cavalrymen. His mission was clear: to crush Scotland. Robert knew there was no avoiding a direct confrontation, but the Scots were hopelessly outnumbered and under-equipped. So, he turned to the one thing the English didn't understand: the land itself. If he could lure their heavy cavalry into marshes and bogs, their armor would work against them. His lightly equipped infantry would then have the upper hand. He led over 500 men, many without proper clothing, to construct defensive fortifications. Once ready, he sent Douglas to provoke Edward II in Valence, tossing down a gauntlet along their path, challenging them to a decisive battle the next day at Loudoun Hill. This time, there would be no retreat. They would face them head-on. Edward II scoffed at the challenge. He had 3,000 ironclad riders and believed one charge would flatten the rebels in an instant. Robert, however, had no such confidence. He ordered his men to hold the defensive line at all costs. Once the enemy cavalry was forced to split and flank from the marshy sides, the Scots would surround them from both wings. Everything else was up to fate. Just as they finished laying their plans, the Lord of Islay arrived with a small band of 40 men. It wasn't much, but to Robert, it was a godsend. The Lord apologized for not supporting him earlier. Robert held no grudge. Instead, he thanked him as if he had expected this all along. At dawn, Robert, clad in old light armor, marched through his ragtag army. Behind him fluttered a tattered, weather-worn banner, but his eyes were steady, and his voice unwavering as he led his soldiers toward the battlefield. Across the plain, the English cavalry lined up like a moving wall of steel. Edward II in Valence sat atop their majestic warhorses, dressed in shining armor, backed by deafening drums, an imposing contrast to the rebels' humble appearance. Edward rode ahead to give a rousing speech. He called Robert a murderer who had spilled blood on holy ground, claimed his next plan was to invade England, and swore to bring him down today. His troops roared in approval. Robert, by contrast, gave no flowery speech. He simply urged every man to fight for what he believed in. The oppressed Scots needed no inspiration. Their fury matched that of the enemy's elite cavalry. At Valence's command, the English cavalry surged forward. The thunder of hooves drowned out the war drums, a deafening tide rushing across the field. Robert's men waited, calm and resolute, shielding the traps behind their formation. Just as the cavalry neared, he ordered his troops to fall back into the trenches. Soldiers behind them raised long spears, ready to intercept any leaping horses. The front line of English riders had no time to slow down. One after another, they plunged into the concealed pits. Valence quickly realized the ambush, but it was too late. His cavalry had lost momentum, trapped between trenches and now within range of Scottish archers. Unable to move, the mounted knights became sitting targets. The Scots pulled them down and finished them off. Douglas and the other commanders held the line fiercely. Valens, realizing he couldn't break the defense, tried to outflank them from behind. Edward II, confused and furious, screamed orders in vain. Just as Robert had planned, the English cavalry charged into the bogs they didn't understand. Heavy armor weighed them down. Horses struggled. Soldiers stumbled. The Scots, agile and enraged, swarmed them. Douglas, in the heat of battle, spotted the man who had once defeated his father and shamed their family name. Fueled by rage, he stormed toward the enemy for a personal reckoning. The entire rebel army fought with the same fire as Douglas, undaunted and unstoppable. Valens stayed cautious, watching from atop his horse, but Edward II, clueless and arrogant, galloped forward with his men straight into the killing ground. By the time he realized he was surrounded by swamps and traps, it was too late. The rebels fought like demons, even the youngest among them killed without hesitation. Valens finally understood the full disaster and shouted for retreat. His battered cavalry dropped their weapons and fled, leaving behind their king alone. Stranded in enemy territory, Robert spotted him. The final confrontation began. Proud and inexperienced, Edward II was no match. Within moments, Robert had him on the ground. He stared down at the English king, humiliated in the mud. Then, in a symbolic act of scorn, he tossed aside his weapon. As Edward II tried to rise, Robert delivered a single punch, shattering his pride, but sparing his life. Keeping such a weak ruler alive, Robert believed, would be more damaging to England than killing him. Letting him crawl back to his army would be the greatest insult of all. As victorious cheers erupted across the battlefield, Robert had won a miraculous victory. This marked a major turning point in Scotland's war for independence. 7 years later, at the Battle of Bannockburn, the Scots struck another devastating blow, handing England one of its worst defeats in over 700 years. In 1328, King Edward III signed the Treaty of Northampton with Robert, officially recognizing Scotland's sovereignty. Elizabeth, held prisoner for so long, was finally freed through a prisoner exchange and reunited with Robert at last. I'm a movie enthusiast. Please subscribe to my channel, and I'll see you next time.